in the hallowed halls of the Ashfield Music Conservatory, a priceless 17th-century Guarneri violin vanishes from a locked case, sparking a web of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a tangle of envy, passion, obsession, and greed among 4 suspects: a stern teacher, a fiery student, a meticulous curator, and a charming collector. As crimson threads and hidden compartments reveal a cunning theft, Miss Marple sets a trap, leading to a shocking confession. A tale of secrets and betrayal. Can you guess the thief before the final note? Chapter 1. The Silent Conservatory. The late autumn sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary's Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the cobblestone path to the Ashfield Music Conservatory. The conservatory, a grand Georgian edifice with ivy curling around its mullioned windows, was the pride of the town, a place where the strains of Mozart and Bach mingled with the rustle of turning pages. Miss Jane Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, walked briskly toward the entrance, her invitation to the evening's recital tucked into her handbag. The event promised a rare treat, a performance on a 17th-century Guarneri violin, a masterpiece of craftsmanship valued not only for its rich tone, but for its historical significance. Inside, the recital hall buzzed with anticipation. Velvet curtains framed a small stage, where a polished oak pedestal held the violin in its glass case, its amber varnish gleaming under the chandelier's light. The audience, a mix of local gentry, music aficionados, and conservatory patrons, filled the room with murmurs of excitement. Miss Marple took her seat in the back row, her keen eyes noting the details others overlooked, the way Mr. Harrow, the conservatory's director, tugged nervously at his moustache. The restless energy of Clara Weston, the young violinist who would play the Guarneri, the fastidious adjustments made by Mr. Quill, the curator, as he checked the case's lock, and the poised elegance of Lord Reginald Hawthorne, a collector whose presence added a touch of grandeur to the evening. The recital began with Clara's performance, her bow coaxing a haunting melody from the Guarneri that seemed to still the very air. Miss Marple, though no expert in music, felt the weight of the notes, their resonance stirring memories of a village choir from her youth. As Clara played, Miss Marple's gaze wandered, cataloguing the audience's reactions. Professor Vance's stern nod of approval, Lord Hawthorne's intense stare, and Mr. Quill's almost possessive hovering near the pedestal. The first half ended to rapturous applause, and the audience rose for the intermission, drifting toward the anteroom for sherry and conversation. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded over her knitting bag, observing the crowd's ebb and flow. She noted Clara lingering near the violin's case, her fingers brushing the ear glass as if in reverence. Professor Vance stood aloof, her sharp features betraying a flicker of disdain as she watched the mingling guests. Lord Hawthorne, glass in hand, spoke animatedly to Mr. Harrow, who nodded with the deference of a man seeking favour. Mr. Quill, meanwhile, darted between the case and the lobby, his eyes never straying far from his charge. It was during this intermission that the unthinkable occurred. As the audience returned for the second half, Mr. Quill approached the pedestal to prepare the violin for the next performer. His face blanched, and a strangled cry escaped his lips. The case, still locked, was empty. The Guarneri was gone. A hush fell over the hall, followed by a crescendo of gasps and whispers. Mr. Harrow, his voice trembling, took to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The police have been called, and no one is to leave until they arrive." The room buzzed with speculation, eyes darting suspiciously among the guests. Miss Marple, her expression serene, adjusted her spectacles and leaned forward slightly. She had seen such disturbances before. Small thefts in St. Mary's Mead, a missing brooch, or a pilfered purse. But the audacity of stealing a priceless violin from a locked case intrigued her. Inspector Crane arrived, his broad frame filling the doorway, his notebook already open. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, but Miss Marple sensed his reliance on procedure over perception. As he began questioning the staff, Miss Marple's mind turned to the human element. A violin like that, she thought, is not merely stolen for money. It is desired, coveted, perhaps even loved. Her eyes flickered to the four figures now at the centre of attention. The teacher, the student, the curator, and the collector. Each, she knew, had a story, and stories, in her experience, always held the key to truth. Chapter 2. The Cast of Characters. The Ashfield Music Conservatory, its recital hall now dimmed by the shadow of theft, had transformed from a temple of music to a stage for suspicion. The air, once vibrant with the echoes of the Guarneri strings, now hummed with whispered accusations and the rustle of nervous movement. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the conservatory's parlour, a cosy room adorned with faded tapestries and a crackling fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her lap. The police, under the command of Inspector Crane, had cordoned off the recital hall and were methodically questioning the guests. But Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and sharp eyes, preferred the parlour's vantage point, where she could observe the ebb and flow of human nature. It was here, amid the clink of teacups and the murmur of anxious voices, that the true contours of the case began to emerge. Inspector Crane, a sturdy man with a square jaw and a penchant for straightforward questions, had identified 4 individuals whose proximity to the stolen Guarneri violin made them prime suspects. He had summoned them to the parlour for preliminary interviews, and Miss Marple, invited to linger as a respected guest, took mental note of each as they entered. She had long believed that people revealed themselves most clearly when they thought themselves unobserved, and the parlour, with its soft light and intimate setting, was an ideal place to watch the masks slip. First to enter was Professor Lydia Vance, the conservatory's violin instructor, a woman whose angular frame and severe expression commanded attention. Her grey hair was pulled tightly into a bun, and her black dress, though elegant, bore the faint wear of years of modest means. She carried herself with the rigidity of a metronome, her movements precise, her gaze unwavering. Yet Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in her hands as she accepted a cup of tea, her fingers brushing the rim with a nervousness that belied her stern demeanour. Lydia was known for her exacting standards, her lessons often leaving students in tears, but her mastery of the violin was undisputed. Rumour had it she resented the conservatory's reliance on the Guarneri's fame to draw patrons, believing her own teaching should be the institution's true draw. When Inspector Crane asked her whereabouts during the intermission, Lydia's voice was crisp. "I was in the staff room, correcting sheet music for tomorrow's lessons," she said. "Alone, I'm afraid. My work requires solitude." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes lingering on the professor's brooch, a delicate gold filigree with a single emerald, far too costly for a teacher's salary. "Such a lovely piece," Miss Marple remarked, her tone mild. "A family heirloom, perhaps?" Lydia's lips tightened, and she murmured something about a gift before turning away. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Envy, she thought, was a motive as old as time, and a woman like Lydia, who had dedicated her life to music, yet lived in the shadow of a single instrument, might harbour resentments deep enough to act upon. Next came Clara Weston, the young prodigy whose performance on the Guarneri had captivated the audience. Barely 20, Clara was a study in contrasts. Her delicate features and auburn curls gave her an almost ethereal quality, but her eyes burned with a fierce intensity that spoke of ambition and passion. She wore a simple green dress, its hem slightly frayed, suggesting a life of modest means despite her talent. Clara's hands, still trembling from the shock of the theft, clutched a handkerchief as she sat across from Inspector Crane. She admitted to lingering near the violin's case after her performance, her fingers tracing its glass as if reluctant to part with the instrument. "It's not just a violin," she said, her voice breaking. "It's alive. When I played it, I felt whole." Inspector Crane pressed her on her movements during the intermission. Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "I was in the restroom," she said. "I needed a moment to collect myself after playing. I was alone." Her alibi was flimsy, and Miss Marple noted the way Clara's fingers twisted the handkerchief, as if wringing out a secret. She recalled a young girl from St. Mary's Mead, a baker's daughter who had stolen a silver spoon out of a desperate longing for beauty. Clara's devotion to the Guarneri was palpable, but was it love or obsession that had driven her actions? "You must feel its loss keenly, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice a soothing balm. Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she offered no further words. "The third suspect, Mr. Ernest Quill, entered the parlour with the precision of a man who lived by order. The conservatory's curator, Quill, was a slight figure with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly pressed suit, his cufflinks polished to a mirror shine. His role was to safeguard the conservatory's treasures, including the Guarneri, and he took his duties with almost fanatical devotion. He recounted his actions with meticulous detail. He had locked the violin's case before the recital, checked it during the performance, and kept the key in his waistcoat pocket at all times. During the intermission, he claimed to have been in the lobby, greeting guests and ensuring the evening ran smoothly. Yet Miss Marple noticed a faint smudge of polish on his fingers, as if he had been handling something delicate, perhaps the violin itself. Inspector Crane, growing impatient, asked why the case showed no signs of tampering. Quill's voice rose, a touch defensive. "I locked it myself. The key never left my possession." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind drifting to a village gardener who had once hidden stolen tools in his shed, claiming they were his own. "You take such care with the conservatory's treasures, Mr. Quill," she said. "It must be a heavy responsibility, knowing their worth." Quill's eyes flickered, and he adjusted his cufflinks with a nervous twitch. "They're not mine to lose," he said, but the words carried a weight Miss Marple found intriguing. Ownership, she thought, could be a matter of heart as much as title. Last to be questioned was Lord Reginald Hawthorne, a man whose presence seemed to fill the parlour despite his measured steps. A wealthy collector of rare instruments, Hawthorne was in his late 40s, with silver-streaked hair and a tailored suit that spoke of old money. His silver cane, topped with an ivory handle, rested against his chair, and his smile was as polished as the cane itself. He admitted to admiring the Guarneri before the recital, his fingers hovering near the case as he spoke to Mr. Harrow about its provenance. During the intermission, he claimed to have been in the audience, discussing the conservatory's funding with the director. Mr. Harrow, when called upon, confirmed this, though his nervous glances suggested a man easily swayed by wealth and influence. Hawthorne's charm was effortless, his voice smooth as he deflected suspicion. "A theft like this is a tragedy," he said, "but why suspect me? I could purchase such an instrument outright." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. She had known men like Hawthorne in St. Mary's Mead, charming, confident, and all the more dangerous for it. "Some treasures, Lord Hawthorne," she said, her tone deceptively mild, "are valued precisely because they cannot be bought." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and Miss Marple made a mental note. Desire, she knew, could drive even the wealthiest to cross lines they would never admit to contemplating. As the interviews concluded, Inspector Crane dismissed the suspects, instructing them to remain available for further questioning. The parlour emptied, leaving Miss Marple alone with her tea and her thoughts. She sipped slowly, her mind sifting through the details like a villager sorting laundry. Each suspect had a motive, however veiled: Lydia's envy, Clara's passion, Quill's obsession, and Hawthorne's greed. Yet motives alone were not enough. The violin had vanished from a locked case with no sign of forced entry, and the key, according to Quill, had never left his possession. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her knitting. She recalled a theft in her village years ago, when a silver candlestick had disappeared from a locked church vestry. The culprit, a choir boy, had used a duplicate key, crafted in secret. The simplicity of the solution had struck her then, as it did now. A key, a moment of distraction, a clever hand. These were the tools of theft, not brute force. But whose hand had wielded them? Lydia, with her hidden wealth and sharp intellect? Clara, driven by a love that bordered on worship? Quill, whose devotion to his artifacts might have twisted into possession? Or Hawthorne, whose polished exterior might conceal a collector's insatiable hunger? Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and made her way to the recital hall. The police were still there, dusting for fingerprints and examining the case. She paused by the pedestal, her eyes tracing its contours. The glass was unmarred, the lock intact. She glanced at the anteroom's single door, its heavy oak unyielding, and the small window too narrow for even a child to pass through. Her gaze settled on the ventilation grate near the ceiling, its screws gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Curious," she murmured, her mind already turning to possibilities others had overlooked. She returned to the parlour, where Inspector Crane was reviewing his notes. "A perplexing case, Miss Marple," he said, his tone weary. "No forced entry, no witnesses, and a room full of people with alibis." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as gentle as a spring breeze. "People, Inspector, are rarely as careful as they think. They leave traces, not in fingerprints, but in the little things they say and do." Crane raised an eyebrow, but Miss Marple offered no further explanation. She had learned long ago that the truth revealed itself in its own time, like a flower unfolding in the morning sun. As she settled back into her chair, her knitting resumed its steady rhythm. The parlour's fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, and Miss Marple's thoughts danced with them. The Guarneri's theft was no mere crime of opportunity. It was a calculated act, born of a desire that burned brightly in one of these 4 hearts. She would watch, she would listen, and she would wait. For in St. Mary's Mead, as in the Ashfield Music Conservatory, human nature was the key to every mystery, and Miss Marple was its most patient observer. Chapter 3. The Scene of the Crime. The Ashfield Music Conservatory's recital hall, so recently alive with the resonance of music, now lay under a pall of suspicion, its grandeur muted by the stark presence of Inspector Crane's police team. The chandeliers, dimmed to conserve light, cast long shadows across the polished floor, and the velvet curtains seemed to absorb the whispers of the few remaining staff. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood unobtrusively near the anteroom where the Guarneri violin had vanished. Her presence was tolerated by the police, who saw her as a harmless elderly lady. But her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. The ante-room, a small chamber off the main hall, was the heart of the mystery, and Miss Marple intended to study it as carefully as she might a neighbour's garden in St. Mary's Mead. The violin's case rested on its oak pedestal, a forlorn relic of the theft. The glass was pristine, the brass lock gleaming under the scrutiny of a constable's torch. Inspector Crane, his notebook open and his brow furrowed, directed his men to measure distances and catalogue fingerprints. The lock, he confirmed, was intact, with no scratches or signs of tampering. The key, according to Mr. Quill, had remained in his waistcoat pocket, and only he and Clara Weston had touched the case prior to the theft. Clara during her performance, and Quill when securing it. The fingerprints bore this out, offering no immediate clues. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, found the absence of evidence as telling as its presence. She stepped closer to the pedestal, her footsteps soft on the parquet floor, and examined the case with the care of a seamstress inspecting a hem. The anteroom itself was unremarkable. A single oak door led to the recital hall, its lock unforced and its hinges silent. A narrow window, high on the wall, admitted a sliver of moonlight, but its frame was too small for even a cat to slip through. Above the pedestal, near the ceiling, was a ventilation grate, its iron lattice unassuming yet oddly compelling to Miss Marple's gaze. She tilted her head, her mind drifting to a theft in her village years ago, when a silver teapot had vanished from a locked pantry. The culprit, a cunning housemaid, had used a hidden compartment in a wall. Locks, Miss Marple murmured to herself, are only as secure as the room they guard. Inspector Crane, overhearing her, turned with a sceptical glance. "Miss Marple, you don't think someone climbed through that grate, do you? It's barely a foot wide." She smiled, her expression as mild as a summer afternoon. "Oh, I shouldn't think so, Inspector. But rooms have secrets, don't they, like people?" Crane grunted, returning to his measurements, but Miss Marple's attention lingered on the grate. Its screws, she noted, were polished, but one bore a faint scratch, as if a tool had grazed it. She made a mental note, her fingers brushing the knitting needles in her bag. The constable assigned to the anteroom, a young man with an earnest face, reported that the room had been empty during the intermission, save for the brief comings and goings of Clara and Quill. Guests had milled about in the hall, but none admitted to entering the anteroom. Miss Marple, however, knew that people often saw more than they realized, or admitted. She approached the constable, her tone gentle. "Tell me, young man, did you notice anyone lingering near this door? Perhaps someone who seemed out of place?" The constable frowned, then recalled a moment when Lord Hawthorne had paused by the door, adjusting his cane. "Didn't think much of it, ma'am," he said. "He's a lord, after all." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A cane, she thought, could be more than a prop. She turned her attention to the pedestal itself, noting its solid construction. It was bolted to the floor, immovable without considerable effort. The case, however, was lighter, designed to protect yet display the violin. She ran a finger along its edge, her touch as delicate as if she were testing the ripeness of a peach. No hidden compartments, no false bottoms. Yet the violin had vanished without a trace, as if spirited away by magic. Miss Marple did not believe in magic, but she did believe in human ingenuity. Someone, she thought, was very clever indeed. She stepped back, her eyes sweeping the room once more. The anteroom's simplicity was its challenge. No hiding places, no obvious means of escape. Yet the violin was gone, and the thief had left no calling card. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, a writer fond of mysteries who had once described a locked room puzzle. "The trick," he had said, "is misdirection." Miss Marple wondered if the anteroom itself was the misdirection, drawing attention from a subtler path. The ventilation grate, perhaps, or something yet unseen. Inspector Crane, growing impatient, called his men to regroup. "We'll need to search the conservatory," he declared. "Every room, every cupboard. The violin can't have gone." Far Miss Marple, however, suspected otherwise. A thief bold enough to steal a Guarneri in a crowded hall would not stash it in a broom closet. She approached the inspector, her voice soft but firm. "Might I suggest, Inspector, that you consider how the violin left this room? A locked case is one thing, but a locked room is another." Crane's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "We'll check the ducts if that's what you mean." Though I doubt a violin could fit through that grate, Miss Marple said nothing, her smile enigmatic. She had no intention of explaining her thoughts, not yet. In St. Mary's Mead, she had learned that truths emerged slowly, like buds in spring, and pushing them only bruised the petals. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple slipped into the recital hall, where a few staff members lingered, whispering among themselves. She overheard a young usher mention Professor Vance's sharp words to Clara after the performance, something about not deserving the Guarneri. Another spoke of Mr. Quill's agitation when he found the case empty, his hands shaking as if he'd lost a child. Lord Hawthorne, meanwhile, had been seen leaving the hall shortly after the theft was discovered. His demeanour calm, but his cane tapping a restless rhythm. Miss Marple filed each detail away, her mind a ledger of human quirks and contradictions. She returned to the anteroom, pausing by the window. The moonlight cast a faint glow, illuminating a speck of dust on the sill. Or was it dust? She leaned closer, her spectacles catching the light. It was a tiny thread, crimson, like the lining of a velvet case. She plucked it with care, tucking it into her handkerchief. Not dust, she thought, but a clue. The thread suggested the violin had been handled, perhaps wrapped, before its disappearance. But by whom? And how had it left this sealed chamber? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Harrow, the conservatory's director, his face pale and his moustache twitching. "Miss Marple, this is a disaster," he said, wringing his hands. "The Guarneri is irreplaceable. If word gets out, our donors will flee." She patted his arm, her touch reassuring. "Courage, Mr. Harrow. Things lost have a way of being found, if one looks in the right places." He blinked, unsure whether to take comfort or offence, but Miss Marple's serene smile disarmed him. As she left the anteroom, Miss Marple's mind churned with possibilities. The locked case, the untouched lock, the crimson thread, the scratched grate, all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thought of the suspects: Lydia's envy, Clara's passion, Quill's obsession, Hawthorne's greed. Each had opportunity, however fleeting, during the intermission's chaos. But opportunity required means, and means required cunning. Miss Marple's needles, resting in her bag, seemed to click in rhythm with her thoughts. The scene of the crime was silent, but it whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Chapter 4. The Teacher's Tale. The morning after the theft, the Ashfield Music Conservatory felt like a house in mourning, its usual vibrancy replaced by a heavy stillness. Miss Jane Marple, having accepted Mr. Harrow's invitation to stay as a guest while the investigation unfolded, sat in the conservatory's library, a high-ceilinged room lined with leather-bound scores and portraits of long-dead composers. The fire in the grate crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the oak table, where Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles idle for once. She had requested a private word with Professor Lydia Vance, and the teacher now sat opposite her, her posture as rigid as a violin string tuned to breaking point. Miss Marple knew that conversations like melodies required a delicate touch to coax out their truths, and she intended to play this one with care. Lydia Vance was a woman of formidable presence, her grey eyes sharp and her lips set in a line that suggested disapproval was her natural state. Her black dress, austere yet tailored, was offset by the emerald brooch Miss Marple had noted the previous evening, a detail that lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord. Lydia's reputation as a teacher was formidable. Students spoke of her with equal parts awe and fear, her lessons a crucible that forged brilliance or broke spirits. Yet her disdain for the conservatory's reliance on the Guarneri's fame was no secret. "It's a crutch," she had once told a colleague, overheard by a loquacious usher, "a shiny bauble to distract from real artistry." Miss Marple began with gentle pleasantries, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "You must find it trying, Professor Vance, to teach in a place so enamoured with one instrument. Your work, I'm sure, is the true heart of this conservatory." Lydia's eyes flickered, a mix of pride and suspicion. "The Guarneri is a tool, nothing more," she said, her tone clipped. "Talent lies in the player, not the wood." "But donors prefer spectacle to substance." Her words carried a bitterness that Miss Marple noted, like a villager observing a neighbour's grudge over a shared fence. She leaned forward, her hands folded neatly. "And yet such a loss must pain you, as one who values music so deeply." Lydia's jaw tightened, and her fingers brushed the brooch, a gesture Miss Marple found telling. "It's a blow to the conservatory's reputation," Lydia admitted, "but I shed no tears for the violin itself. It served its purpose." The words were cold, but Miss Marple sensed a heat beneath them, like embers under ash. Envy, she thought, could burn quietly for years before flaring into action. Seeking to probe further, Miss Marple turned the conversation to the evening of the theft. "You were in the staff room, I believe, during the intermission?" Lydia nodded, her gaze steady. "Correcting sheet, music for my advanced class. Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata, if you must know. It's a demanding piece, and my students require precision." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes soft but searching. "Such dedication, and no one disturbed you?" Lydia hesitated, a fleeting pause that Miss Marple caught like a missed note. "No one," she said firmly. "I prefer to work alone." Miss Marple's mind turned to a spinster in Saint, Mary's Mead, Miss Elspeth, who had once claimed solitude while hiding a stolen locket in her sewing basket. Alibis, she knew, were only as strong as the truth behind them. She changed tack, her tone light. "Your brooch is quite striking, my dear. A gift, you said last night?" Lydia's hand flew to the emerald, her fingers lingering as if to shield it. "From a former student," she said quickly, "a token of gratitude." But her eyes darted away, and Miss Marple sensed a lie, as subtle as a wrong key in a sonata. A teacher's salary did not stretch to such luxuries, and gifts of that nature often came with strings attached. The conversation shifted to the conservatory's inner workings. Lydia spoke of the pressure to attract wealthy patrons, her voice laced with scorn for Mr. Harrow's fawning over figures like Lord Hawthorne. "He'd sell the soul of this place for a cheque," she said, then caught herself, her lips pursing. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind cataloguing the resentment. Lydia's envy was not just of the Guarneri's prestige, but of the power it wielded, the power to draw attention, funds, and favour. Could such envy, Miss Marple wondered, have driven her to steal the violin, perhaps to sell it and fund a life beyond the conservatory's constraints? As Lydia rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the stiffness in her stride, as if she carried a burden heavier than her duties. "Thank you, Professor," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You've been most helpful." Lydia paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and glanced back with a flicker of unease. "I hope you find your thief, Miss Marple," she said, and was gone. Alone again, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving through the conversation's threads. Lydia's alibi was unverified, her demeanour guarded, and her brooch a puzzle that hinted at hidden means. She recalled a village scandal years ago when a schoolteacher had sold church candlesticks to fund a secret debt. The signs had been there, small extravagances, curt denials, and Miss Marple saw similar signs in Lydia. But suspicion was not proof, and the locked case remained a barrier to certainty. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and made her way to the staff room where Lydia claimed to have been. It was a cramped space, cluttered with music stands and stacks of scores, its single window overlooking a quiet courtyard. Miss Marple examined the desk, finding a pile of sheet music marked with Lydia's precise annotations, the Scher Kreutzer Sonata, as she had said. But the ink was dry, the pages undisturbed, suggesting no hurried departure. Yet something caught Miss Marple's eye, a faint smudge of polish on the desk's edge, similar to the one she had noticed on Mr. Quill's fingers. Curious, she thought, for a teacher to handle polish. Had Lydia been near the violin's case, despite her claims? She stepped into the courtyard, her eyes scanning the cobblestones. A scrap of paper, caught in a crack, drew her attention. It was a receipt, faded but legible, for a jeweller in a nearby town. The item listed was vague, custom piece, but the date was recent and the amount substantial. Miss Marple tucked it into her handkerchief beside the crimson thread from the anteroom. People, she mused, are so careless with their secrets. Returning to the library, she considered Lydia's tale anew. The professor's envy was clear, her alibi weak, and her brooch a clue to possible motives beyond mere resentment. Had she stolen the Guarneri to sell it, using the proceeds to fund a life of small luxuries? Or was her role subtler, perhaps as an accomplice to another's greed? Miss Marple's needles, now resumed, clicked in time with her thoughts. Lydia Vance was a woman of discipline, but discipline could mask desperation, and desperation could lead to daring acts. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting light through the library's windows, Miss Marple felt the puzzle's edges sharpening. The teacher's tale was but one movement in this symphony of deceit, and she would listen closely for the next. In St. Mary's Mead, she had learned that truth often hid in the pauses between words. And here, in the conservatory's hushed halls, she would find it yet. Chapter 5. The Student's Passion. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Ashfield Music Conservatory's practice room, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Miss Jane Marple sat on a cushioned bench, her knitting bag at her side, its contents untouched, as she awaited Clara Weston, the young violinist whose performance on the stolen Guarneri had enthralled the recital hall. The room, with its faded wallpaper and scattered music stands, held a quiet intimacy, a space where students bared their souls through their instruments. Miss Marple had chosen this setting deliberately, knowing that Clara, with her fiery spirit, might reveal more here than in the formal confines of the parlour. The air carried a faint scent of rosade, and the distant hum of a cello practice underscored the conservatory's heartbeat. Clara entered, her auburn curls slightly dishevelled, her green dress creased from a morning spent pacing. At 20, she was a prodigy whose talent had drawn whispers of future greatness, but her eyes, red-rimmed and restless, betrayed a turmoil that went beyond the theft. She clutched a violin case, not the Guarneri's, but her own modest instrument, and her fingers trembled as she set it down. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and unassuming air, gestured to a chair. "Sit, my dear," she said, her voice as warm as a village hearth. "You've had quite a shock, haven't you?" Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice raw. "The Guarneri! It was like playing a piece of heaven. And now it's gone." Her words carried a reverence that struck Miss Marple, reminding her of a young girl in St. Mary's Mead, who had cherished a borrowed pearl necklace, only to weep when it was reclaimed. Passion, Miss Marple knew, could be a dangerous muse, leading to acts of both creation and destruction. She began softly, her tone conversational. "Your performance last night was remarkable, Clara. I'm no musician, but even I could feel the soul in your playing. The Guarneri must have felt like an extension of yourself." Clara's eyes lifted, a spark of pride mingling with her distress. "It was," she said. "When I played it, it was like I was speaking for the first time, not just notes, but something deeper." Her hands twisted together, and Miss Marple noted the calluses on her fingers, the marks of a life devoted to her craft. Seeking to ease Clara into the heart of the matter, Miss Marple asked about the evening of the recital. "You were near the violin's case after your performance, weren't you?" "I saw you linger, as if reluctant to let it go." Clara flushed, her cheeks a vivid pink. "I couldn't help it," she admitted. "I just wanted to be near it a little longer." "It's not just a violin. It's a voice, a story. I touched the case, but I didn't open it, I swear, I didn't." Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple's heart softened, though her mind remained alert. Sincerity, she knew, could cloak guilt as easily as innocence. "And during the intermission," Miss Marple pressed, her tone still gentle, "you said you were in the restroom, collecting yourself. It must have been overwhelming, playing such an instrument before such a crowd." Clara nodded, her eyes welling. "I needed a moment alone. I was shaking after the performance, and I didn't want anyone to see me like that." Her alibi, like Lydia's, was solitary, unverifiable, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her voice, as if the weight of suspicion pressed against her. She shifted the conversation, her eyes soft but searching. "You must feel its loss so keenly, my dear. To play such an instrument, to feel its power, and then to lose it." She trailed off, watching Clara's reaction. The girl's hands clenched, and a tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "It's not just the violin," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "It's what it meant. A chance to be more than just a student, to be heard. Without it, I'm nothing." The words were raw, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to a village boy who had stolen a book from the vicarage, believing it held the key to his dreams. Passion, she thought, could blind one to reason, turning desire into desperation. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice a soothing balm. "You're far from nothing, Clara. Your talent shines with or without that violin. But tell me, did you see anyone near the anteroom during the intermission? Anyone who seemed out of place?" Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I saw Mr. Quill by the case, checking the lock. And Lord Hawthorne was nearby, talking to Mr. Harrow. But I wasn't really paying attention. I was too caught up in my own head." Her vagueness was frustrating, but Miss Marple sensed truth in her distraction. A girl lost in her emotions might miss a thief's sleight of hand. The conversation turned to Clara's life at the conservatory. She spoke of her rigorous lessons under Professor Vance, whose criticism, though harsh, had honed her skill. "She says I'm gifted," Clara said, "but she also says I'm reckless, that I let my feelings get in the way." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Lydia's stern demeanour. "And does she ever speak of the Guarneri?" she asked. Clara's eyes darkened. "She hates how much attention it gets." "Once, she told me it was a distraction, that true musicians don't need relics to prove their worth." The words echoed Lydia's own, but Clara's tone held no resentment, only a quiet awe for her teacher. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the crimson thread she had found in the anteroom, tucked safely in her handkerchief. She wondered if Clara, in her moment of reverence by the case, had noticed anything amiss. "When you touched the case," she said, "did it feel secure? Nothing loose or unusual?" Clara frowned, thinking, "It was locked, if that's what you mean. I didn't try to open it, but—" She paused, her eyes narrowing. "There was a faint sound, like a click when I leaned against it." I thought it was just the pedestal settling. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. A click, she thought, could mean many things. A lock, a latch, or something more cunning. As Clara spoke, Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the frayed hem of her dress, the scuffed shoes, the signs of a life stretched thin by ambition and limited means. Talent alone, she knew, did not pay for lessons or lodgings. Had Clara's passion for the Guarneri driven her to take it? perhaps believing it belonged in hands that truly loved it? Or was her distress merely the grief of a young artist robbed of her muse? Miss Marple recalled a saint, Mary's Mead seamstress, who had stolen a bolt of silk, driven by a longing to create something beautiful. Clara's love for the violin was palpable, but love could twist into possession. The interview drew to a close, and Clara rose, clutching her violin case as if it were a lifeline. "I didn't take it, Miss Marple," she said, her voice fierce. "I'd never do that." "But I wish I knew who did." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch as light as a feather. "I believe you mean that, my dear. And we shall find the truth." In time, Clara's eyes searched hers. Then she nodded and left, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Alone, Miss Marple sat back, her mind sifting through Clara's words. The girl's passion was undeniable, her alibi weak, and the click by the case a tantalizing clue. She thought of the ventilation grate, the scratched screw, the crimson thread, each a fragment of the puzzle. Clara's devotion to the Guarneri could have led her to act rashly, but her tears felt genuine, her distress unfeigned. Yet Miss Marple knew that youth could be impulsive, and impulses could lead to mistakes. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and made her way to the anteroom, determined to test Clara's recollection. The pedestal stood as before, its case empty and mocking. Miss Marple leaned gently against it, mimicking Clara's gesture, and listened. No click came, but the wood creaked faintly, suggesting a structure not as solid as it appeared. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing. The case was locked, but the pedestal itself. She filed the thought away, her mind already turning to the next encounter. As she returned to the practice room, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery deepen. Clara's passion was a melody that could inspire or destroy, and its true notes remained elusive. In St. Mary's Mead, Miss Marple had learned that the heart's desires often led to the truth, but they could also lead astray. She would listen, she would watch, and she would wait, for the thief's misstep was only a matter of time. Chapter 6. The Curator's Obsession. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting a soft amber glow through the leaded windows of the Ashfield Music Conservatory's archive room, a cavernous space filled with the musty scent of old paper and polished wood. Shelves lined with meticulously catalogued scores and instrument records stretched to the ceiling, their order a testament to the fastidious care of Mr. Ernest Quill, the conservatory's curator. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table near a window, her knitting bag at her feet, its needles silent as she awaited Quill's arrival. She had requested a private conversation, citing a desire to understand the conservatory's treasures. But her true aim was to probe the man whose life revolved around their protection. The theft of the Guarneri violin had struck at the heart of Quill's domain, and Miss Marple suspected his reaction held clues as vital as any fingerprint. Mr. Quill entered with the precision of a metronome, his slight frame clad in a pressed suit, his wire-rimmed spectacles glinting in the fading light. His cufflinks, polished to a mirror sheen, caught Miss Marple's eye, as did the faint smudge of polish on his fingers, a detail she had noted the night of the theft. His face, usually composed, bore the strain of sleeplessness, his eyes darting nervously as he took a seat. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped but polite, "I trust you're here to discuss the conservatory's collection, though I confess I'm at a loss with this dreadful business." His hands folded tightly on the table, as if anchoring himself against the chaos of the theft. Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as gentle as a village vicar's. "Indeed, Mr. Quill, your work here is remarkable. Such care for these instruments, it must feel like guarding a piece of history." Quill's chest puffed slightly, pride flickering through his tension. "It's a responsibility," he said. "The Guarneri, in particular, is a masterpiece. Its loss is unthinkable." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the possessive tone, as if the violin were not merely the conservatory's, but his own. She began with a soft inquiry, her tone conversational. "You were so diligent last night, checking the case before and after the recital. Tell me, how does one ensure such a treasure's safety?" Quill's eyes lit up, eager to explain his methods. He described the lock, a bespoke mechanism requiring a unique key, which he kept in his waistcoat pocket at all times. "I locked the case myself before the recital," he said, "and checked it during Clara's performance. It was secure. I'd stake my reputation on it." His fingers adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous tick Miss Marple found revealing. She recalled a saint, Mary's Mead shopkeeper, meticulous to a fault, who had hidden stolen coins in his ledger, believing his orderliness above suspicion. And during the intermission, she asked, her voice mild, "You were in the lobby, greeting guests, I believe?" Quill nodded, his lips pursing. "Yes, ensuring the evening ran smoothly. My duties extend beyond the artifacts to the conservatory's reputation." His alibi, like those of the others, was solitary in its critical moments, and Miss Marple wondered if his presence in the lobby was as constant as he claimed. She leaned forward, her eyes soft but piercing. "It must pain you, Mr. Quill, to see such a treasure vanish under your watch, almost as if a part of you were stolen." Quill's face flushed, and his hands clenched. "It's a betrayal," he said, his voice low. "That violin was in my care. I protect what's mine, the conservatory's. The slip was subtle, but Miss Marple's ears caught it, like a false note in a familiar tune. Yours, mister." "Quill?" she asked, her tone innocent. He corrected himself quickly, his spectacles glinting as he shifted. "A figure of speech. My duty is to safeguard, not to own." But his unease lingered, and Miss Marple filed it away, her mind turning to a village librarian who had hoarded rare books, claiming they were safer in her hands. She shifted the conversation to the case itself, probing for details. "The lock was untouched, they say. Quite a puzzle, isn't it? Almost as if the thief had a key." Quill's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, defensive. "Impossible. There's only one key, and it never left my pocket. I'd know if it had." His insistence was fervent, but Miss Marple noted a bead of sweat on his brow. She thought of the ventilation grate in the anteroom, its scratched screw, and the crimson thread she had found. "And the case itself," she said, "was it always on the pedestal? Never moved or opened before the recital?" Quill hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. "Never," he said. "It was secure from the moment I placed the violin inside." Miss Marple's mind churned. Quill's obsession with control was evident, but obsession could breed blindness or cunning. Had he tampered with the case, perhaps creating a way to remove the violin without unlocking it? Or had he been outwitted, his meticulous nature a perfect cover for another's guile? She recalled a saint, Mary's Mead gardener, who had locked his shed religiously, only to find his tools stolen by someone who knew his habits too well. Quill's devotion to the Guarneri might have made him a guardian, or a target. Seeking to test his reactions, she mentioned the anteroom's layout. "That's ventilation grate, mister." Quill, such an odd feature in a room meant for treasures. "Do you ever inspect it?" His face paled, and his fingers froze on his cufflinks. "It's just for air circulation," he said quickly. "Far too small for anything else." His voice wavered, and Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The grate, she thought, was more significant than anyone admitted. She made a mental note to examine it further, perhaps with a borrowed screwdriver. As the conversation drew to a close, Miss Marple turned to Quill's life at the conservatory. He spoke of his years of service, his pride in cataloguing every instrument, his sleepless nights ensuring their safety. "The Guarneri was my crown jewel," he said, his voice softening. "To lose it—" He trailed off, his eyes distant. Miss Marple patted his hand, her touch reassuring. "You've done your best, Mr. Quill, and we shall find it, I'm sure." He looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and wariness, and rose to leave. Alone in the archive room, Miss Marple stood and approached the shelves, her eyes scanning the neatly labelled files. She found the Guarneri's record, a detailed log of its maintenance signed by Quill. The last entry, dated the morning of the recital, noted a routine cleaning. She frowned, recalling the polish on Quill's fingers. Cleaning a violin was delicate work, but the case? She opened her handkerchief, studying the crimson thread and the jeweller's receipt from Lydia's courtyard. A new thought struck her. What if the case's lining had been tampered with? Allowing the violin to be removed without unlocking it? Quill, with his access and obsession, would know every inch of that case. She left the archive room, her steps slow but purposeful, and made her way to the anteroom. The pedestal stood as before, the empty case a silent accusation. She examined the lock again, her fingers tracing its contours. No scratches, no dents, but the base of the case felt slightly loose, as if it could be lifted. She paused, her mind racing. A false bottom, perhaps? Or a clever mechanism known only to someone intimate with the case's design? Quill's slip of the tongue, "What's mine?" echoed in her thoughts. As she returned to her guest room, Miss Marple felt the puzzle's pieces shifting. Quill's obsession was a double-edged sword. It made him a diligent guardian, but also a potential thief, driven by a need to possess what he protected. The Polish, the grate, the loose case, all hinted at a deeper truth. In St. Mary's Mead, she had seen how devotion could twist into fixation, and Quill's heart, she suspected, beat in time with the Guarneri's strings. She would watch him closely, for the curator's obsession might yet betray the thief's hand. Chapter 7. The Collector's Charm. The evening air in St. Mary's Mead carried a crisp edge, and the Ashfield Music Conservatory's drawing room glowed with the warmth of a fire, its flickering light dancing across the polished mahogany furniture. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, the needle still as she sipped a glass of sherry, offered by the conservatory's director, Mr. Harrow. The room, with its heavy drapes and portraits of stern-faced patrons, was an ideal setting for her next encounter. With Lord Reginald Hawthorne, the wealthy collector whose presence at the recital had added a sheen of prestige and now suspicion. Miss Marple had requested this meeting, citing an interest in his renowned collection of rare instruments, but her true purpose was to unravel the charm that cloaked his motives. She knew from her village days that men like Hawthorne, with their polished exteriors, often hid the most intricate secrets. Lord Hawthorne entered with the grace of a man accustomed to command, his silver-streaked hair catching the firelight, his tailored suit immaculate. His silver cane, topped with an ivory handle carved into a swan's head, rested lightly in his hand, a prop that seemed both elegant and calculated. He smiled as he took a seat, his eyes crinkling with a warmth that Miss Marple recognized as practiced rather than genuine. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as the sherry, "I'm flattered by your interest in my collection. Though I suspect you're more curious about this unfortunate theft." His candour was disarming, but Miss Marple's serene smile gave nothing away. She began with a gentle deflection, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "Your reputation as a collector precedes you, Lord Hawthorne. Such a passion for rare instruments must make the Guarneri's loss particularly poignant." He nodded, his expression one of cultured regret. "A tragedy, indeed. The Guarneri is a singular piece, its tone, its history. To think it's been snatched by some common thief." He shook his head, but Miss Marple noted the slight curl of his lip, as if the notion of a common thief amused him. She recalled a saint, Mary's Mead Squire, whose charm had masked a penchant for pilfering rare roses from neighbours' gardens, claiming they were better appreciated in his own. Seeking to probe his involvement, Miss Marple turned to the evening of the recital. "You were admiring the violin before the performance, I believe?" Quite close to the case, if memory serves, Hawthorne's smile didn't waver. "Guilty as charged," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I couldn't resist. Its craftsmanship is exquisite. Stradivari himself would have envied it. But I assure you, I was merely an admirer, not a thief." His tone was playful, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his cane, its ivory head gleaming. A cane, she thought, could conceal more than status. "And during the intermission?" she asked, her voice mild. "You were with Mr. Harrow, discussing the conservatory's future, I understand." Hawthorne nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Indeed." Poor Harrow was fretting about funding, as always. I offered some advice, perhaps a promise of support. We were in the audience, surrounded by guests. His alibi was corroborated by the director, but Miss Marple noted the ease with which he recounted it, as if rehearsed. She thought of a village merchant who had charmed his way out of a theft accusation, only to be caught by a stray receipt. Charm, she knew, was a thief's best disguise. She sipped her sherry, her eyes soft but searching. "You must have quite a collection, Lord Hawthorne. Instruments like the Guarneri, are they often for sale, or do you acquire them differently?" His laugh was rich, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of wariness in his eyes. "I buy what I can," he said. "The open market, auctions, private sales. But some pieces are too rare for purchase. They require persuasion." He leaned forward, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. "Why steal what I could afford, Miss Marple?" "It's beneath me." His confidence was almost convincing, but Miss Marple's mind flashed to the crimson thread from the anteroom, the scratched screw on the ventilation grate. Persuasion, she thought, could take many forms. She shifted the conversation to his collection, probing for cracks in his composure. "I've heard your gallery is remarkable," she said. "Instruments from across the centuries, each with a story. Do you ever lend them out, or are they too precious to leave your care?" Hawthorne's smile tightened, and his fingers brushed the cane's handle. "They're safest with me," he said. Museums and conservatories mean well, but they lack the personal touch. My instruments are played, cherished, not locked away like relics. His words carried a passion that echoed Clara's, but Miss Marple sensed a possessiveness that bordered on greed. She recalled a saint, Mary's mead collector of rare coins, who had justified theft by claiming he alone could appreciate their worth. Seeking a new angle, she mentioned the anteroom security. That locked case was quite secure, wasn't it? Almost as if the thief knew its secrets. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed, but his smile held. A clever trick, no doubt. But I'm no locksmith, Miss Marple. My talents lie in appreciation, not larceny. His deflection was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the way his cane tapped faster, a rhythm of unease. She thought of the loose base of the case, the faint click Clara had heard. Could a man like Hawthorne, with his wealth and connections, have acquired a duplicate key or a subtler means of access? As the fire crackled, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the conservatory's patrons. Hawthorne spoke freely of his influence, his donations a lifeline for institutions like Ashfield. Harrow depends on men like me, he said, a hint of arrogance creeping in. Without us, this place would crumble. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Mr. Harrow's nervous deference. A man beholden to wealth might overlook much, she thought, including a collector's indiscretions. She recalled a village benefactor who had used his generosity to mask shady dealings, his charm a shield against suspicion. The interview drew to a close, and Hawthorne rose, his cane tapping a final note. I hope you find your thief, Miss Marple, he said, his smile as polished as his cufflinks. But I fear it's a hopeless case. The Guarneri is likely far from here by now. His confidence grated, and Miss Marple's serene nod hid her resolve. Oh, I think it's closer than you imagine, Lord Hawthorne, she said, her tone light. He paused, his eyes flickering, then bowed and left, his cane's echo lingering in the room. Alone, Miss Marple set down her sherry, her thoughts weaving through the encounter. Hawthorne's charm was a carefully crafted mask, his alibi solid but reliant on a nervous director. His passion for rare instruments was undeniable, but was it admiration or obsession? She thought of the ventilation grate, the crimson thread, the loose case, each a clue pointing to a calculated act. Hawthorne's wealth could buy keys, silence, or accomplices, and his cane, she suspected, was more than a gentleman's accessory. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and made her way to the conservatory's lobby, where a young usher was sweeping. "Tell me, dear," she said, her voice kind, "did you see Lord Hawthorne during the intermission?" Perhaps with his cane near the anteroom? The usher frowned, then nodded. He was by the door for a moment, adjusting his cane. I thought he dropped something, but he waved me off. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. A cane could conceal a tool, a key, or even a slender object like a violin, if disassembled. She tucked the thought away, her fingers brushing the crimson thread in her handkerchief. As she returned to her guest room, Miss Marple felt the mystery's threads tightening. Hawthorne's charm was a melody that could sway hearts, but it could also hide a thief's intent. In St. Mary's Mead, she had seen how wealth and charisma could cloak deceit, and she suspected Lord Hawthorne's collection held secrets darker than its polished surfaces. She would watch him, as she watched them all, for the truth was a note waiting to be played. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Grate. The morning mist clung to the grounds of the Ashfield Music Conservatory, softening the outlines of its ivy-clad walls and lending an air of secrecy to the quiet halls. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her shawl against the autumn chill, stood once more in the ante-room where the Guarneri violin had vanished. The room, with its single oak door, narrow window, and unyielding pedestal, was a puzzle that refused to yield its secrets easily. Yet Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing what others overlooked, felt the answer lay not in the obvious, but in the overlooked corners of this locked chamber. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, settled on the ventilation grate near the ceiling, its iron lattice a silent witness to the theft. She had noted its scratched screw the night of the crime, and now, armed with a borrowed screwdriver from the conservatory's janitor, she intended to probe its mysteries. The anteroom was empty, the police having shifted their focus to searching the conservatory's outbuildings. Inspector Crane, diligent but bound by procedure, had dismissed the grate as too small for a thief's passage, but Miss Marple was not so certain. In St. Mary's Mead, she had once solved a theft when a village boy hid stolen apples in a chimney flue, a space no one thought to check. "People," she murmured, "are so quick to dismiss what seems impractical." She approached the grate, her steps careful on the parquet floor, and balanced on a low stool the janitor had provided. The screwdriver, cold in her hand, fit neatly into the screws, which turned with surprising ease, as if recently loosened. As the grate came free, a faint draught brushed her face, carrying a trace of dust and something else, a faint musky scent like aged velvet. Peering into the duct, she saw little in the dim light, but her fingers, exploring the edge, found a tiny scrap of crimson fabric caught on a jagged seam. She plucked it carefully, holding it to the light. It matched the crimson thread from the anteroom's windowsill, confirming her suspicion that it was from the violin case's lining. "Now, how did you find your way up here?" she said softly, tucking the scrap into her handkerchief beside the thread and the jeweller's receipt. The duct was narrow, too small for a person, but wide enough for a slender object like a violin, if carefully manoeuvred. She replaced the grate, her mind racing with possibilities. Miss Marple stepped down, her shawl slipping slightly, and returned the screwdriver to the janitor, a grizzled man named Tom who lingered by the door. "Find anything, Mum?" he asked, his eyes curious. She smiled, her expression serene. "Only dust, Tom, but dust can tell stories, can't it?" He chuckled, shaking his head, and Miss Marple made a mental note to ask him later about the conservatory's maintenance routines. A janitor she knew saw more than most, and Tom's weathered face suggested a man who noticed details. She moved to the pedestal, its empty case a mute accusation. The loose base, noted during her earlier inspection, intrigued her. She pressed gently, testing its give, and heard a faint creak, not unlike the click Clara had described. Kneeling, a task her knees protested, she examined the underside, her fingers tracing the wood. A seam, almost invisible, ran along the base's edge, suggesting a panel that could be lifted. She didn't force it, wary of alerting the thief, but the discovery confirmed her suspicion. The case was not as secure as it appeared. Someone with intimate knowledge, perhaps Mr. Quill, with his curator's precision, or Lord Hawthorne, with his collector's cunning, could have exploited it. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Professor Vance's envy might have led her to tamper with the case, perhaps to sell the violin and fund her hidden luxuries, like the emerald brooch. Clara's passion could have driven her to a reckless act, though her tears seemed genuine. Quill's obsession made him a candidate for hoarding the violin, his slip of "what's mine" echoing in her mind, and Hawthorne, with his charm and wealth, had the means to orchestrate a theft, perhaps using his cane to conceal a tool, or even the violin itself, disassembled. The grate, she thought, was the key. Not a passage for a person, but a temporary hiding place. A clever misdirection. She left the anteroom and wandered to the conservatory's courtyard, where the morning mist was lifting, revealing cobblestones slick with dew. The receipt she had found near the staff room, hinting at Lydia's extravagance, weighed on her mind. She sat on a stone bench, her handkerchief open in her lap, the crimson scraps and receipt a small constellation of clues. The grate's role suggested a thief who knew the conservatory's layout intimately, someone who could act swiftly during the intermission's chaos. She recalled a saint. Mary's mead theft, where a stolen brooch was hidden in a church organ's pipes, retrieved later when suspicion had faded. The Guarneri, she suspected, was not far, perhaps stashed in a nearby room or passed to an accomplice. Her reverie was interrupted by Inspector Crane, who approached with a weary sigh. "Miss Marple, we've searched the outbuildings. Nothing. The violin's likely out of the county by now." She tilted her head, her smile gentle. "Oh, I think it's closer, Inspector." Thieves are bold, but they're also cautious. They don't stray far from their prize. Crane frowned, unconvinced, but agreed to inspect the ventilation ducts, though he grumbled about the effort. Miss Marple offered no further explanation, knowing that truths revealed themselves in their own time, like a melody unfolding note by note. As Crane left to summon his men, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the conservatory's upper windows, where a flicker of movement caught her eye. It was Clara, practicing in a studio, her bow moving with a fervour that spoke of both talent and turmoil. Miss Marple watched, wondering if the girl's passion had led her to the grate, perhaps in a moment of desperation. Or was it Quill, whose obsession might have driven him to hide the violin where only he could retrieve it? Or Hawthorne, whose cane and charm suggested a man capable of intricate schemes? Lydia's envy, too, could not be dismissed, her solitary alibi and costly brooch pointing to hidden motives. Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted, and made her way to the library, where she could think undisturbed. The grate's clue was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. How had the violin been moved through the duct without detection? And who had the knowledge and the nerve to use such a hiding place? She thought of the loose case, the crimson scraps, the scratched screw. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the crime, and she was determined to weave them together. As she settled into a library chair, her knitting needles resumed their quiet rhythm, a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. In St. Mary's Mead, she had learned that the smallest details, a misplaced button, a stray word, could unravel the grandest schemes. The Guarneri's thief had been clever, but cleverness left traces, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them. The grate had whispered its secret, and she would listen until the full melody of the truth emerged. Chapter 9. The Web of Motives. The ash-filled music conservatory's parlour, with its heavy velvet curtains and flickering firelight, seemed to hold the weight of the mystery within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned armchair, her knitting bag at her side, its needles silent as she prepared to address the 4 suspects gathered at her request. The air was thick with tension, the crackle of the fire mingling with the soft rustle of nervous movements. Inspector Crane stood by the door, his notebook open, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Miss Marple had suggested this meeting, not to accuse, but to observe, for she knew from her scent, Mary's Mead days, that people revealed their truths most clearly when pressed together, like threads in a tightly woven cloth. The suspects sat in a semicircle, their faces a study in contrasts. Professor Lydia Vance, her posture rigid, her grey eyes sharp with defiance. Clara Weston, her auburn curls framing a face pale with anxiety. Mr. Ernest Quill, his spectacles glinting as he adjusted his cufflinks. And Lord Reginald Hawthorne, his silver cane resting against his chair, his smile as polished as ever. Miss Marple, her shawl neatly draped, began with a gentle smile, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority earned through years of quiet observation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this theft is a puzzle, but not an unsolvable one. The Guarneri violin, a treasure to us all, was taken with cunning, but cunning leaves traces. I've been thinking, as I often do, about the people in this room, and how each of you, in your way, loved that violin, or what it represented." Her eyes moved from face to face, noting the slight flinch in Lydia's jaw, the tremor in Clara's hands, the tightening of Quill's lips, and the faint narrowing of Hawthorne's eyes. She recalled a village gathering where a stolen pie had sparked accusations, each neighbour's reaction revealing more than their words. She turned first to Lydia, her tone mild. "Professor Vance, your dedication to music is unquestioned, but the Guarneri's fame must have grated, drawing attention from your teaching. Envy, I've seen, can lead even the most disciplined to act." Lydia's face flushed, her fingers brushing her emerald brooch. "I've no need for relics," she snapped. "My work speaks for itself." Yet her voice held a tremor, and Miss Marple thought of the jeweller's receipt, hinting at a need for funds beyond a teacher's means. Envy, she mused, could drive one to sell a stolen treasure for a taste of luxury. Next, she addressed Clara, her eyes softening. "Miss Weston, your passion for the violin was clear in your performance. To play such an instrument must have felt like touching a dream. But dreams can blind us, can't they? Make us believe we deserve what we cannot have." Clara's eyes welled, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "I loved it," she whispered, "but I didn't take it. I couldn't." Her sincerity was palpable, but Miss Marple recalled the click she'd heard by the case, and the crimson thread from the grate. Passion, she knew, could lead to impulsive acts, quickly regretted. Turning to Quill, Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Mr. Quill, your care for the conservatory's treasures is almost a devotion. The Guarneri was your pride, wasn't it? Losing it must feel like a personal failure, or perhaps a reason to keep it close, where only you could protect it." Quill's spectacles flashed as he leaned forward, his voice sharp. "I guarded it faithfully. The key never left me." His defensiveness was telling, and Miss Marple thought of the polish on his fingers, the loose case, the scratched great screw. Obsession, she thought, could twist duty into possession. Finally, she faced Hawthorne, her smile unwavering. "Lord Hawthorne, your collection is the envy of many. A man of your means could buy most treasures, but some, I suspect, are too rare to purchase outright. Greed, even in a gentleman, can lead to unconventional acquisitions." Hawthorne's laugh was smooth, his cane tapping lightly. "My dear Miss Marple, Why steal what I could afford? This is a game for lesser men. His confidence was a shield, but Miss Marple noted the restless tap of his cane, recalling the usher's tale of him lingering by the anteroom door. Greed, she knew, thrived on the thrill of possession, not just wealth. Inspector Crane shifted, his patience thinning. Miss Marple, this is all very well, but we've no evidence. The case was locked, the key with Quill. How could anyone have taken it? She tilted her head, her eyes twinkling. Locks, Inspector, are only as secure as the hands that hold them. And rooms, like people, have their secrets. She paused, letting her words settle, then recounted her findings. The crimson scraps from the grate and sill, the scratched screw, the loose case base. The violin, I believe, was slipped through the ventilation duct, a temporary hiding place, not an exit. Someone knew the anteroom well, and acted swiftly. The suspects stirred, their faces a gallery of unease. Lydia's hand clenched her brooch. Clara's eyes darted to the floor. Quill adjusted his cufflinks, and Hawthorne's smile tightened. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. Each of you had a moment during the intermission, a chance to act. Professor Vance, alone in the staff room, could have slipped into the anteroom unnoticed. Miss Weston, in the restroom, was steps away from the door. Mr. Quill, in the lobby, knew the case's every detail. And Lord Hawthorne, with Mr. Harrow, was near enough to distract or deceive. She paused, her gaze steady. But motive alone is not enough. The thief needed means, a way past the lock. She leaned forward, her hands folded. The case's loose base suggests a trick, perhaps a hidden panel. The great scratched screw tells of a hurried act. And the crimson thread, part of the case's lining, shows the violin was handled, perhaps wrapped, before it vanished. Her words hung in the air, and she watched the suspect's reactions. Lydia's sharp intake of breath, Clara's trembling lip, Quill's frozen stare, Hawthorne's subtle grip on his cane. She recalled a saint, Mary's mead theft, where a stolen watch was hidden in a flower pot, the thief betrayed by a speck of soil on his shoe. Here, the clues were subtler but no less telling. Inspector Crane cleared his throat. So you're saying one of them tampered with the case? But how? Quill's key. Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile gentle. A key, Inspector, or a copy. Or perhaps no key was needed if the case could be opened another way. People are clever, you know, when they want something badly enough. She didn't elaborate, knowing the seeds of doubt would work their own magic. The parlour felt smaller, the fire's warmth unable to dispel the chill of suspicion. As the suspects rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes followed them, her mind a ledger of their tells. Lydia's guarded defiance, Clara's raw emotion, Quill's nervous precision, Hawthorne's calculated ease. The web of motives was clear: envy, passion, obsession, greed. But the thread that tied them to the crime remained elusive. She thought of the grate, the loose case, the crimson scraps. The thief had been bold, but boldness left traces, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them. She remained in the parlour, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. In St. Mary's Mead, she had learned that truth often emerged in the quiet moments, when people thought themselves safe. The Guarneri was close, she felt it, and the thief's next move would reveal them. She would wait, as she always did, for the melody of deceit to fold her, and the truth to play its final note. Chapter 10. The trap is set. The Ashfield Music Conservatory, its halls hushed under the weight of the ongoing investigation. seemed to hold its breath as evening fell. The parlour, where Miss Jane Marple had earlier confronted the suspects, now served as a council chamber of sorts, with Inspector Crane pacing before the fire, his broad face etched with frustration. Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the inspector's latest report. The search of the conservatory's grounds and outbuildings had yielded nothing. No trace of the Guarneri violin, no hidden caches, no telltale signs of a thief's retreat. Yet Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, believed the violin was closer than the police suspected, and she proposed a plan to flush out the culprit. "Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a village breeze, "sometimes a thief needs a nudge to reveal themselves. People, you see, are rarely as clever as they think when they're afraid of being caught." Crane paused, his notebook half open, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect for the elderly lady's insights. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" he asked. She smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Announced that a witness has come forward. Someone who saw the thief near the anteroom during the intermission. Say you'll search the suspects' homes this evening. Fear, Inspector, has a way of loosening tongues and prompting mistakes." Crane rubbed his chin, considering. "A bluff, you mean?" "Risky, but it might shake something loose." He agreed to the plan, and within the hour, he gathered the 4 suspects, Professor Lydia Vance, Clara Weston, Mr. Ernest Quill, and Lord Reginald Hawthorne, in the conservatory's recital hall where the theft had occurred. The hall, still grand despite its somber mood, amplified the tension as the suspects took their seats, their faces a gallery of unease. Miss Marple sat at the back, her knitting bag at her side, her gaze sharp as she watched each reaction. Inspector Crane stood before the pedestal, the empty violin case a stark reminder of the crime. "We've had a development," he announced, his voice firm. "A witness has come forward, claiming they saw someone tampering with the case during the intermission. We'll be searching your residences this evening, starting with Lord Hawthorne's estate. As it's closest, I suggest you cooperate fully." The words landed like a stone in a still pond, ripples of reaction spreading across the suspects. Lydia Vance's face paled, her hand clutching her emerald brooch as if it were a talisman. Clara Weston's eyes widened, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. Quill's spectacles glinted as he adjusted his cufflinks, his fingers trembling slightly. Hawthorne, however, leaned back in his chair, his silver cane resting against his knee, his smile as smooth as ever. "A bold move, Inspector," he said, his tone light, "but you'll find nothing at my estate but fine instruments and finer wine." Miss Marple noted the confidence in his voice, but also the restless tap of his cane, a tell she had come to recognize. As the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple approached Crane, her voice low. "Start with Hawthorne's estate, Inspector, but watch him closely. A man so sure of himself is often hiding something." Crane nodded, though his expression suggested he still doubted the violin's proximity. Miss Marple, however, was certain. The crimson scraps from the grate, the loose case base, the scratched screw, all pointed to a thief who had not fled far. She recalled a saint, Mary's mead theft, where a stolen locket was hidden in a neighbour's attic, the thief waiting for the hue and cry to die down. The Guarneri, she suspected, was similarly close, perhaps entrusted to an accomplice or concealed in a clever hiding place. The police convoy, with Miss Marple discreetly included at Crane's invitation, arrived at Hawthorne's estate as dusk settled over the countryside. The manor, a sprawling Georgian pile surrounded by manicured gardens, exuded wealth and taste. Hawthorne greeted them at the door, his charm undimmed, offering tea and assurances of cooperation. "Search as you please, Inspector," he said, gesturing expansively. "My home is an open book." Miss Marple, trailing behind, noted the faint tension in his smile, the way his eyes followed the officers as they fanned out through the house. The search began in the grand hall, its walls lined with portraits and display cases of rare instruments. A Stradivarius cello, a Baroque flute, a harpsichord with ivory keys. Miss Marple lingered by a case, her fingers brushing the glass, her mind on the guarneri. She thought of the crimson thread, the ventilation grate, and Hawthorne's cane, which he now leaned on lightly as he guided Crane through the rooms. The police moved methodically, checking drawers, cabinets and closets. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the study, a room Hawthorne had mentioned with pride during their earlier conversation. The study was a collector's sanctum, its shelves heavy with leather-bound books and curios, its desk cluttered with papers and a silver inkstand. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, settling on a bookshelf that seemed slightly misaligned, its edge not flush with the wall. She approached, her shawl slipping slightly, and ran her fingers along the wood. A faint click sounded, and a panel slid open, revealing a velvet-lined compartment. Empty. Her pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. "He's moved it," she whispered to Crane, who joined her with a frown. "Moved what, Miss Marple?" She gestured to the compartment. "The violin, I suspect." This was its hiding place, but our announcement has prompted caution. Crane's skepticism softened as he examined the compartment, its crimson velvet a match for the scraps she had found. "Clever," he muttered, "but where is it now?" Miss Marple's mind raced. The trap had worked, forcing the thief to act, but the violin's new hiding place was the next puzzle. She thought of Hawthorne's frequent visits to a local antique shop, mentioned by a conservatory usher, as a place he frequented for rare books. A collector she knew might entrust a prize to a discreet ally, and an antique shop was a perfect front. She turned to Hawthorne, who stood by the door, his cane tapping a slow rhythm. "A beautiful study, Lord Hawthorne," she said, her tone mild. "You must spend many hours here, surrounded by your treasures." His smile was tight. "A man needs a sanctuary, Miss Marple." She nodded, her eyes lingering on his cane. Its ivory handle, she thought, was large enough to conceal a small tool, or perhaps a key. She recalled the usher's tale of Hawthorne lingering by the anteroom door, adjusting his cane. A man of his means could have bribed Quill for a duplicate key, or used his knowledge of rare instruments to exploit the case's loose base. As the search concluded without the violin, Crane's frustration grew. "Nothing here," he said, turning to Miss Marple. "Your witness hasn't panned out." She smiled, undeterred. "Oh, but it has, Inspector. The empty compartment tells us the thief is nervous and close. I suggest we visit a certain antique shop in town tomorrow. Lord Hawthorne is known there." I believe Hawthorne's eyes flickered, but his smile held. "A quaint shop," he said. "I buy books there, nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already on the shop's dusty shelves, where a violin might hide among forgotten relics. As the convoy returned to the conservatory, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. The trap had stirred. The thief and the empty compartment was a clue as telling as any. In St. Mary's Mead, she had seen how fear could unravel even the cleverest plans, and she sensed that the thief's composure fraying. The Guarneri was near, she felt it, and the next move would bring it into the light. She would watch, as always, for the slip that would play the final note of this intricate melody. Chapter 11. The Collector's Mistake. The morning sun broke through the mist over St. Mary's Mead, casting a pale light on the cobblestone streets that led to the town's modest antique shop, a quaint establishment tucked between a bakery and a tailor's. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly adjusted, walked beside Inspector Crane, whose broad frame seemed out of place among the delicate storefronts. The trap set the previous evening, the announcement of a witness and the search of Lord Hawthorne's estate, had stirred the thief, as evidenced by the empty velvet-lined compartment in his study. Miss Marple was certain the Guarneri violin was close, and the antique shop, where Hawthorne was known to frequent, beckoned as the next piece of the puzzle. Her mind, sharp as the autumn air, wove together the clues. The crimson scraps from the ventilation grate, the loose case base, the scratched screw, and now the hidden compartment, all pointing to a thief whose confidence was beginning to crack. The shop, with its faded sign reading Waverley's Antiques, was a labyrinth of dusty treasures, porcelain figurines, tarnished silver, and stacks of leather-bound books. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and the shopkeeper, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, looked up from his ledger. His name, Miss Marple had learned from the conservatory's usher, was Mr. Waverley, a man known for discretion and a willingness to handle special items for wealthy clients. His eyes darted between Miss Marple and Crane, his hands fidgeting with a fountain pen. "Good morning," he said, his voice thin. "How may I assist you?" Inspector Crane, his notebook open, wasted no time. "We're investigating the theft of a violin from the Ashfield Conservatory. We have reason to believe it may have passed through here." Waverley's face paled, his fingers tightening on the pen. "A violin? I deal in books and trinkets, not instruments," he said, but his voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the bead of sweat on his brow. She recalled a saint, Mary's Mead grocer who had fenced stolen silver, his denials betrayed by a trembling hand. "Of course, Mr. Waverley," she said, her tone gentle, "but you know Lord Hawthorne, don't you?" "He's a regular here." I understand. Waverley's eyes widened, and he stammered, "Lord Hawthorne?" "Yes, he buys books, first editions mostly." "Nothing more," Miss Marple smiled, her eyes soft but piercing. "Books are such treasures, aren't they? And sometimes they hide other treasures." She wandered to a corner of the shop, her fingers brushing a stack of dusty tomes. Behind them, partially concealed by a faded curtain, was a wooden crate, its lid slightly askew. Her pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. "Might we look at your recent acquisitions, Mr. Waverley?" Just to be thorough, Crane, catching her drift, nodded to a constable, who moved to the crate. Waverley's protests grew shrill. "That's just old stock, nothing of interest." But the constable lifted the lid, revealing a bundle wrapped in crimson velvet, its hue a perfect match for the scraps in Miss Marple's handkerchief. The constable unwrapped it carefully, and there, gleaming in the dim light, was the Guarneri violin, its amber varnish unmarred, its strings taut as if waiting to sing. Crane's jaw dropped, and Waverley slumped against the counter, his face ashen. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Well, well," she said softly, "it seems the violin wasn't so far after all." Crane turned to Waverley, his voice stern. "Explain this, or you're coming with us." Waverley's hands shook as he confessed, his words tumbling out. "Lord Hawthorne brought it to me last night, after your search. He said it was a loan to keep safe. I didn't ask questions. He pays well, you see." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the pieces together. The trap had worked, forcing Hawthorne to move the violin from his study's hidden compartment to the shop, fearing discovery. Crane dispatched a constable to summon Hawthorne, who arrived within the hour, his silver cane tapping a defiant rhythm. His charm faltered as he saw the violin on the counter, but he recovered quickly, his smile tight. "A misunderstanding, surely," he said. "I entrusted it to Waverley for safekeeping, nothing more." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "Lord Hawthorne, the violin was taken from a locked case, through a ventilation grate, and hidden in your study. You bribed Mr. Quill for a duplicate key, didn't you? And used your cane, perhaps, to pass the violin through the duct during the intermission's chaos." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed, but he laughed, a hollow sound. "Preposterous! Why would I steal what I could buy?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Because, my lord, some treasures are valued for their rarity, not their price. You wanted the Guarneri for your collection, where it would be yours alone." She turned to Crane, her voice steady. "The crimson velvet in your study, the scratched screw in the grate, the loose case base, all point to a calculated plan. Mr. Quill's key, or a copy, made it possible. Crane, now convinced, confronted Quill, who was brought to the shop in handcuffs, his face a mask of shame. Under pressure, he admitted to accepting a bribe from Hawthorne for a duplicate key, crafted months earlier under the guise of maintenance. "I didn't think he'd steal it," Quill muttered. "He said he just wanted to study it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, recalling a saint. Mary's mid-clerk who had sold church keys, believing no harm would come. Greed, she knew, could corrupt even the most meticulous. Hawthorne, cornered, dropped his facade. "It belongs with me," he said, his voice low. "In my gallery, it would be cherished, not paraded for donors." His confession was reluctant, but the evidence, the violin, the velvet, the key, was undeniable. Crane ordered his arrest, and the shop fell silent, save for the faint jingle of the bell as the constables led Hawthorne and Quill away. Miss Marple stood by the counter, her fingers brushing the Guarneri's case. The shop, with its dusty relics, had been the thief's undoing, a misstep born of panic. She thought of the crimson thread, the scratched screw, the hidden compartment. All traces of a plan unravelled by her quiet persistence. The violin was safe, and the truth, as always, had emerged like a melody from the silence. Chapter 12. The Quiet Resolution. The Ashfield Music Conservatory, bathed in the soft glow of a late September afternoon, seemed to exhale as the Guarneri violin was restored to its rightful place. The recital hall, once a stage for suspicion, now hummed with a quiet relief, its oak-panelled walls echoing with the promise of music to come. Miss Jane Marple stood by the pedestal, her shawl neatly draped, her eyes lingering on the violin's amber curves, safe once more in its glass case. The lock had been repaired, the loose base secured, and Mr. Harrow, the director, hovered nearby, his moustache no longer twitching with panic. The thief, Lord Reginald Hawthorne, was in custody, his accomplice, Mr. Ernest Quill, facing charges for his role in providing a duplicate key. Yet Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond the surface, knew that the resolution of a mystery often left ripples in its wake. She had requested a final moment in the conservatory before returning to St. Mary's Mead, and Mr. Harrow, grateful for her role in recovering the violin, had insisted she stay for tea in the parlour. The room was warm, its fire crackling softly, and Clara Weston joined them, her auburn curls tamed but her eyes still shadowed by the ordeal. Miss Marple, seated in her familiar armchair, sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking gently as she studied the young prodigy. Clara's performance had sparked the chain of events, and Miss Marple sensed the girl carried a burden beyond the theft's resolution. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, "you must be relieved to see the Guarneri safe. It's a treasure, but your talent is the true gift here." Clara's lips trembled, and she nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I thought I might have lost it forever," she said, her voice soft. "When I played it, I felt like I was someone." Without it, she trailed off, and Miss Marple's heart stirred, recalling a saint, Mary's Mead girl, who had clung to a borrowed dress, believing it defined her worth. Leaning forward, Miss Marple's eyes were kind but searching. "You confessed to temptation, didn't you? To take the violin, to keep it for yourself." Clara's cheeks flushed, and she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I stood by the case, and for a moment I thought, what if it were mine? But I couldn't. It wasn't right." Her honesty was raw, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle. "You did right, my dear. The heart wants what it wants, but it's what we do with those wants that matters." She thought of the crimson thread, the scratched great screw, and how close Clara's passion had come to leading her astray. Yet the girl's restraint had saved her, a melody of integrity amidst the discord of greed. Miss Marple turned the conversation to the conservatory's future. Mr. Harrow, his confidence restored, spoke of plans for a new recital series, with Clara as a featured soloist. "The Guarneri will be played, not just displayed," he said, and Clara's eyes brightened. A spark of hope rekindled. Miss Marple smiled, knowing that talent, like a seed, needed only a chance to grow. She thought of Professor Lydia Vance, whose envy had not led to theft, but to a quiet resignation, her lessons resuming with a newfound humility. Quill's disgrace, however, was a cautionary tale, his obsession with control undone by a single bribe. As tea concluded, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and bid farewell to Clara and Harrow. She walked through the conservatory's halls, her steps slow but purposeful, her mind reflecting on the case. The Guarneri's theft had been a symphony of human flaws. Envy, passion, obsession, greed, each note played by a suspect with their own desires. Yet it was Hawthorne's greed, cloaked in charm, that had orchestrated the crime, with Quill's complicity as its counterpoint. The crimson thread, the loose case, the hidden compartment, all were notes in a melody Miss Marple had followed to its crescendo. Outside, the station's platform was quiet, the train to St. Mary's Mead, waiting with a gentle puff of steam. Miss Marple boarded, her shawl adjusted, her knitting resumed as the countryside rolled by. She thought of the village, where small mysteries, stolen eggs, missing letters, had honed her understanding of human nature. The Guarneri's theft was grander, but its truth was the same. People betrayed themselves in their desires, their slips, their moments of carelessness. Hawthorne's cane, Quill's Polish, the great scratched screw. Each had whispered its part in the tale. As the train rattled on, Miss Marple's needles clicked, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The case was closed, the violin safe, but she knew life would bring new puzzles, new melodies to unravel. In St. Mary's Mead, as in the Ashfield Conservatory, the human heart was the key to every mystery. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was its most patient listener. She smiled, her eyes on the horizon, ready for the next note to sound.